Okay, everybody, I am lucky to have back again for a second time my dear friend James Tunney, who's agreed to chat with me today. We're gonna be given, I think, a treasure trove of information as we always do. For more on James, you'll look in the description. You'll have a full bio. He's kind of a Renaissance man to me. He's a barrister, an artist, a poet, an author, a mystic, just all around pretty decent guy. And he's been kind enough to talk with me again today. So, James, thanks again, my friend.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leslie. Paul, it's great to see you again. Great to have a chance and to continue the conversation we had before. So thank you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One thing last time we talked that we just briefly touched on, and I told you I really wanted to go a little more into this, is this idea of sovereignty, of personal sovereignty and personhood. Now, in a culture, at least, and this is just my perception, a culture to where we kind of are individualistic. I'm talking mainly Western culture. There tends to be a growing trend to move away from things that are focused on the individual. And some people can make the argument, collectivist societies, can be very healthy. But at the core of personhood, even within a collective society, there's some element of personhood and personal sovereignty. So I wonder if you could just kind of start out your perspective, because I think it's really, you make some really important distinctions that I think a lot of people might be interested in.
Yeah, in your work, Paul, I'm sure that you never have to consider a starting point, or you make an assumption about who it is that you're dealing with. So I presume when you go to college and all that, there's a presumption that you know what a person is, that we're familiar with the idea that we're dealing with a human person. But unfortunately, this idea, construct, this reality is being attacked by a number of different forces, by technology, by philosophy, by ideology. And the argument is that the human person is a construction. So the post-humanism and transhumanism begins to say, well, really, the person is a collection of attributes. So we can mechanize some of those attributes. We can move beyond. So there isn't this concept of a person. And in that context, or the human is going to be deconstructed. So the deconstruction movement is seeking to say, well, humans are bad. The concept of humanity was linked to white European males, and that's what it meant, and therefore it's bad, so we can move on to something else. And consistent with that, there are some more positive elements of it which say, well, what about animals, and can they have personhood? And you begin then to seek lowest common denominators. So, but there is an attack on the idea of what a person is and whether there is anything which is a person. It's an incredible deconstruction. There is an attack on the idea of what a human is. And in some senses, people can, if you look at Buddhism, for example, in some ideas, they can look at the person as a collection of attributes. Right. So this is kind of, in some ways, for some people, is consistent with the idea of a deconstructive idea of the person. And the idea of the person seemed to be a Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian construction that came from a theological base. So opponents of that, of personhood and humanity, who may want to have a collectivist approach, are deliberately deconstructing the idea of personhood and what a human is. And associate with that is a scientific attack on the idea. So we have this, what has been described as neuromania, which says that, we're just a collection of, it's an over-focus on neurological correlates and measurements and quantification as analysis of what personhood is. So they say, oh, well, I can see that lights, if I put something in your brain, this part functions, so that's what it is. And then you factor in evolutionary psychology, and they say, well, these things evolved and they're only responses to the environment. So there's nothing intrinsic there. There's no intrinsic person. So science is saying, or certain bad experiments, in my view, say that, well, free will doesn't exist. So they're trying to answer theological issues, issues that they don't have the capacity to answer, with physiological experiments, reductionist experiments, bad experiments, poor experiments, in my view. So that is associated as well with the issues associated with consciousness. They can't find out or explain consciousness away. So they begin to say, well, consciousness doesn't exist. It's simple, take it out of the equation. And then when you say consciousness doesn't exist, well, then you can make different judgments about it. Like if, God forbid, something happens and they're saying, is this person conscious or not? You can look at a set of criteria and say, no, consciousness is gone. Many people that study the brain say, and very, very bright people say, we lose consciousness when we go asleep. Now, that's a nonsense idea. Our consciousness never goes away. There's different states of consciousness. But I mean, they say that with a straight face. So the reductionist kind of scientific idea combined with a mathematical idea, which says we can reduce the individual to conscious agents. So therefore, we can allow humans and robots be considered in the same category. And we should give rights to robots. While they're taking rights away from persons, from real persons, they are giving rights, or they want to give rights to animals and to robots. And there is a process which seeks to take away the idea of the individual, which has grown up over a period of time, to deconstruct that. And that will allow greater management of us, greater use of us, because the ethical restraints will disappear, and they will be able to do things that they want to do. So that's a starting context.
Yeah. And as you're saying that, James, I'm sitting here in my mind thinking, as I've always kind of wondered, the world of B.F. Skinner, who was a renowned behaviorist, excuse me, in the 50s and 60s. It's like he never went away. It's just kind of gone under the surface a little bit, because he wrote this really intriguing book called Walden 2, in which, you remember that one? Yeah. And this whole, it's a bit of a novel based on his ideas, but basically this whole community or commune, with the principles of operant conditioning, which is positive negative reinforcement and punishment, can create this almost utopian belief, because the perception underneath the surface of the book is that we are just kind of robotic in our nervous system, and we just program the nervous system. And then you get, like you mentioned, people like Daniel Dennett, who's a brilliant guy, but he argues that consciousness doesn't exist, and it's just a bit of a figment of our imagination. And yet some people still wonder, his colleagues is he really even being serious? Because it reminds me of Bertrand Russell, when he was trying to figure out paradoxes, and he said the answer is just ignore them. So he could so just put it to the side. And I kind of hear that's coming back, those ideas. Well, we can't explain consciousness, put it to the side, and maybe we can just program our society and culture into this. But here's the thing, and I'd like for you to, wherever you're going to go, include it. Who's doing the programming?
Yeah. Right. Well, what happened, in my view, and there is a specific historical analysis we can take. There's different streams in it, but if we look back in the British Empire, we have various phases in relation to a transfer from what it used to do and how it operated. And if you look at the period associated with Thomas Huxley and the use of Darwinism, and it's very, very interesting about evolution. People miss this point, not the religious point about what it's about. Of course, we have a distinction already at the start with Darwin and Wallace's view of natural selection. And of course, Wallace disappeared because he was interested in the spirit, and they couldn't have the spirit. They wanted to take the spirit out of it. It was the dispiriting that we talked about before. And then, so we move on, and they begin to take anything associated with spirituality out of it, so that in an imperial sense, can begin to insinuate itself into knowledge itself, into epistemology, ontology, how we see the world. So in the 1920s, well, in the first decade of the 20th century, there was the Italians, futurism. They loved speed and that philosophy, speed, war, it's incredible. I mean, the things that machines, and that influenced people like E.M. Forrester, who saw the danger. He envisaged a context that we're living underground and run by a machine, communicating as we are now, which you can see later on. Philip K. Dick talks about it in The Penultimate Truth, where everyone is living underground because they believe that there's a war going on, which is not actually going on. They're being deceived, which is another interesting story. But in the 1920s, a number of scientists began to say, well, they began to take this idea of evolution a bit further. And this was there from the 1860s and 1870s. So the irony, the paradox, now, as you said, paradox is the golden rule, is there are no golden rules, as George Bernard Shaw said. But the paradox is that the essence of evolution and natural selection was explaining how we were adapted to the natural world. And that was the sole explanation. Immediately, they said, now that we've understood that, we are going to take over evolution. So then hence you get eugenics and the idea of breeding and taking over. So there's an inherent paradox in there. If they understood better that we should be adapted to our natural environment, why did they immediately begin to engage in processes which make us unadapted to our environment? It doesn't go together. There's an inherent paradox right from the start there. So they say, and remember that I'm not making this a British Irish thing. I'm talking about imperial structures in this, but so they're very interested in breeding, breeding for the pyramid of people, horses, dogs, things that are very they're very interested in this idea. That comes to people, eugenics, the eugenics movement, and then after the First World War, they began to look at the economy and say, listen, we can run the economy as well. And after the Second World War, they had more experience. There is this argument in the United States as well that some of the foreign interventions have been utilized in order to gain better knowledge about how to organize things. This is an argument that serious scholars make. And then they transfer it back to the people at home. After the Second World War in Britain, you had the cybernetics movement, and you had the equivalent in the United States. So what they did was they brought, as you know, they brought all the disciplines together, zoologists and chemists and sociologists and the behaviorists in particular. And they said, okay, we want to understand about human behavior. And the reason why they wanted to engage in this was to control people. The word cybernetics tells you governance, steering. So they said, not only can we change the supply chain, change the system, we can manage people because people are objects. And this is a thing that's certain behind the psychotherapy movement. We go back to William Stern and people. They said he made a clear point in 1900. He said, in the distinction between persons and things, he made it very, very clear that we can't treat people as things. It's worse than treating people as things, objectification. They want to make us into things. And this is what they said. This is Bernal said, that they would mechanize the human body. They don't like the organic. Now, this is explained on another stream of thinking about technocracy and technology. And Jacques Ellul, a great French scholar who wrote about the technological society, he explained that as well as technology, you have this process called technique. That's just about how you do things. Right. And it involves technology, but it could be anything. It could be an accounting system or tax system. And these become big monsters that manage us, that we have to begin to adapt to them, those systems. And he said that in any of these systems, the organic is always driven out. You get artificiality. Now, what's happening related to that is automaticity, the making the world automatic. So you have a direct conflict between automaticity and autonomy. Right. So autonomy now is becoming the autonomy of the machines. They're talking about that. What it's at the expense of is autonomy of us. So sovereignty, which I think is the bedrock, which comes from the idea of what a person is, a human is. They firstly have that sovereignty. This is what all the spiritual traditions say. They have their self-worth esteem, divine consciousness, fractal of the divine consciousness, spark of the divine consciousness, Brahman, Atman, whatever. All the traditions, spiritual traditions, say that you're divine. You're made in the image of God. So this is the description of the deep consciousness that we have in us, which is fundamental. And a lot of these mathematicians say, oh, consciousness is fundamental in the universe, but human consciousness is not. So they are talking about mathematical consciousness or mathematical things, machines, ratiocination, and associated with that is a deep misanthropy, a deep love of machines, and a kind of hatred of humanity. And people haven't understood that this system is getting so good. And the scientists 100 years ago said, and this is what is written by Bernal, the great crystallographer, he said that scientific corporations, this was the policy, along with other people like H.G. Wells and Arthur C. Clarke and those people afterwards, he said scientific corporations will take over the world by stealth. And the people that didn't want to do what the scientific elite would want would be the subject of experiment and would live in a human zoo. This is what the man said. It's written about. It's nothing secret. It's nothing. And that was part of the concept of H.G. Wells, the New World Order, which is described as a conspiracy theory. That was the name of the man's book. And that's the description is of a scientific elite which runs the world. Now, the consequence of that is there is no inherent idea of the person in science. There's just a set of functions. There's just an opportunity for experiment, for curiosity. There isn't any inherent commitment in science to what the human person is. And in fact, the commitment in science, the sole defining thing of science for many people is this curiosity. And then you can put in commerce on that and whatever. If you talk to a lot of scientists, it's that curiosity. Other scientists are driven by a deeper, if you go back to Robert Boyle, for example, these were Christians, the father of chemistry. They were Christians, and they saw there was no inconsistency between the experimental method and believing in Christianity, whatever. There was a split afterwards because at some stage, what I call the empire of scientism, the idea that we would have an empire run by scientism. Now, I'm not talking about science. I'm not criticizing science. I'm talking about scientism as an ideology would come in. And that is at the expense of human autonomy. And that's why we're under so much pressure. And that's why our world is being turned, like by King Midas, it's been turned automatic. And your autonomy to do things will be reduced. And, you might like driving your car. I don't know. 10 years time, you won't be driving a car. The car will be driving you, So all these little things, bit by bit, takes away human autonomy.
As you just said that reminds me, there was what you just said, that there's a comedian who's still around. He escaped from Russia, named Yakov Smirnoff. And he would do this bit about living in the Soviet Union. And I remember one of his lines was, in Russia, you don't drive car drives you. Yeah. And everyone laughs. I mean, it was funny. Now it's kind of like, what? It is becoming, it's becoming true. We had a big program in the 80s called Knight Rider about a car that could think and had consciousness and would drive. It's a fun kids, show.
Yes, yeah, remember
that underneath there's that thing that the consciousness is a controllable commodity. And that's what I'm getting. And again, this is just my personal view. It's like, if we can't control things, we have to design apparatus to control. And if I can just take consciousness out of the equation, then it's easier for me as whoever I am, whether I'm a political leader, a thought leader of some kind, to control and to create outcomes that I want. But it depends on, can I control consciousness? And I don't think you can. So if that's the case, then we have to put all these other, at times, covert things in place to at least give the illusion that we can.
Well, it's interesting. If you look at people who were leaders in the consciousness studies, John C. Lilly, for example, his experiments initially were they're engaged in studying brainwashing and things like that. Right. And then the experiments. the monkeys and chips and implants and etc. He was very aware of them. That was what led him to some of his consciousness expansion. And then a lot of the figures associated with the counterculture, even psychedelics, they were working with the authorities. You know about the studies of Cameron and the various psychiatrists, and the study of how to use pharmaceutical objects to achieve results. It's about the concept of prosthesis. This is a key concept. So prosthetics are very, very good, very, very useful. They've been used for throughout history, going back to ancient Egypt. They found artificial toes and that. So that's great. So the function in that medical context is to restore a lost function, to restore a person to normal expectations. Nobody has any problem with that. A pacemaker or whatever. This is just, it doesn't come from, say, transhumanism. It doesn't come from technology itself. It comes from the long history of people studying about the heart and the body and how it works. And then this is a technical means to achieve that. That's just restoration of normal function. But the idea of transhumanism is fundamentally about enhancement by prosthesis. So the prosthesis is something which is added on. It's a technical enhancement. So the idea is to move from our normal humanity, what we used to be, persons, or for certain people, to move on, to be enhanced in some sense. And that can be done with machines, or it can be done pharmaceutically. And a lot of the movements already in recent culture have been affected by prosthesis. For example, if you take the counterculture, I'm very interested in what happened in the counterculture in the 60s and 70s in California, or as I've written about recently, in the altered state of California, because it's a very, very interesting experiment. So you have a lot of good guys, and you have a lot of guys that you don't know who's good and kind of bad guys. But there's an interest in people that when you look at what they said, it's something different than what people think they've said. For example, Terence McKenna was very interested in prosthesis, chemically and technically, and he was in favor of that movement. He would have been a supporter of that movement, which a lot of people don't seem to say that. Once you say mushrooms, people think you're on their side for some for some reason. But once you say psychedelics, and they, oh yeah, great, and it's not necessarily so, because I'm very open to the contextualized exploration of these, and I understand the therapeutic uses, but there is a kind of a sale of a certain product in this context. If you look at what was a defining issue in the 60s, was the contraceptive pill.
Yeah.
And that's a prosthesis to stop something happening in the body. And that was a big liberation thing. That was a major force that people forget about. It was a pharmaceutical intervention in the culture that had effects. And then there's a lot of people we know about the various MK Ultra and all this kind of stuff about the government for intelligence reasons getting interested in doing experiments, and then very strange things, very strange people, including if you look at the history of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was involved in experiments. Whitey Bulger, the criminal. There's something strange going on. There's even books written about. Well, anyway, we don't want to be going into that domain, but you have this idea that the public and person can be manipulated by pharmaceuticals and by technical addition. Now, it's sold always as something good. This is a great enhancement. You can have your mobile phone is great. It's a great enhancement. Elon Musk says you're a cyborg once you have the mobile phone. He's correct on that, because it begins to outsource functions that were done inside. It begins to put your memory outside. It begins to replace social interaction. So I say we're getting dependent on those things. Even the people that don't have them are dependent on them. I don't have a mobile phone yet, but it's not far away. They're forcing you. I mean, it's hard to avoid. Now, if you look at the World Economic Forum recently, they're talking about personalized medicine. Personalized medicine involves insertion of chips into your brain. This is what they're talking about. I mean, this is quite clear. This is what they're saying. So the insertion of chips now as a cure for depression, and as a whole for depression. Now, you know about how easy it is or difficult to define, or how someone, if they want to, can define depression, as opposed to something a proper clinical depression, whatever that I'm sure you and your colleagues would agree about. There are other peripheral things which are,
Yeah.
maybe a public conception of the person, normal kind of ups and downs of life, whatever, which is not in that same category. So now people can get chips for these things. So they can't control consciousness yet, but once you begin to engage in these, using the knowledge which was gained from the military industrial complex about how you enter the body, how you colonize the body, well, then you can do it. So the problem is, it's about the network. It's not so much the object, but you are made part of the network. This is how the network works. The more people come in the network, the more dependent you become, the more successful the network, you create network effects. And at a certain point, they will say, look at these mobile phones, they're obsolete. You need a chip, Paul. You need a little chip. It's easy. We won't drill the big hole in your head. You can get a little thing that kind of goes in your ear or something, and it fulfills all the functions. And with quantum computing, and you talk to your friend, this little chip, no problem. Now we're already there in relation to the surveillance society. We're already there in relation to our movements. Nobody noticed all the CCTV coming along. Nobody noticed how pervasive it is, how much money, always for our benefit, even though it seems a lot more insecure daily life for a lot of people. We're told that this is all for our benefit, and in reality, it doesn't. Those fruits don't seem to be there. So the problem is the creation of network dependency, which allows mass scale insertion of some low-level technology to achieve control functions as a substitute for good management of society.
Mm-hmm. When you were saying about the counterculture with the psychedelics, things like that, I think I remember reading Alan Watts made some comments. I think someone was asking him, why didn't he continue using LSD? And his comment, and I'm paraphrasing, was something to the extent of, well, when after you finally gotten the call, you hang up the phone. Because he saw it as this kind of this, okay, you've had this experience, you get something from it, but then you take your insights back to your daily life to grow as a human. And a lot of other people in that never really, went back. It's like they wanted to continue to expand. And that's an interesting metaphor to the same, like you're saying, we start here, oh, we have the phones, oh, then it does this, and it just continues. Whereas some of us, well, and I have a phone right here. I still don't know how to use it. I made the joke the other day that I punched in something and my shower turned on. That's how bad I am with it. But it's here. It knows when I go to work. If I get in my car, it wants to tell me how to get to work. So that's another, and then how do you go back? Like Alan Watts went back to regular life. I don't think we can. At least that's what they're wanting. They want us to keep expanding.
Well, it's a big problem, and actually, my argument is that we're coming to the end of Homo sapiens in many sense. I mean, it really is this deep, because when you come to the stage where that which was there before is changed into something else, and because a lot of people as well, transhumanists, they regard the individual as a machine, as a computer, a biological computer. So you say, Paul, you're a bad machine that has to be upgraded. Mm-hmm. It's just the way it is. We have to upgrade you. You understand, because you won't function in society, because we're going to make your interaction with society very complex. And if you don't have this, Paul, you need this, Paul. You need this little thing in your ear, Paul. It won't be sore. Everyone's getting. Look at all these celebrities are getting it. Normalization process theory. So that expands. That's not going to go away. It's colonization. The body is going to be colonized. Consciousness is going to be colonized. That's what's happening. So they're shifted. No, you don't have to go send all your battleships across the world. You just use your scientific, technical, medical prowess to intervene in the body to control consciousness. And as a result of that, you can colonize the consciousness. That will expand. Whatever remaining autonomy you have, we'll take it away. Now, to stop you rebelling against this, we'll give you these, we're going to make it easier for you to sit at home with your soma, to love your servitude. This is what they told us. Aldous Huxley was telling us what's going to happen. So you sit at home, you can have your psychedelic experiences.
Mhm.
They won't be for that breakthrough. So you go to the different level. It won't be for that. It will be to manage you, to make you love your servitude, as they said, to believe that you're engaging in great spiritual exploration. When you're really having, at a certain point, you will be only having the physical sensations of it. It will be kind of a drug. And another concept associated with automaticity is addiction, make your behavior, make you become an addict. And Colin Wilson talked about this from in relation to his spiritual explorations, that everyone has a kind of robot in us.
Mhm.
And, it can be different degrees, but if we think of the autonomic nervous system and the systems that work without us thinking, the key functions, there is an analogy that our psychology can work in that way. We work automatically. Get up in the morning, do things, brush your teeth, go, whatever, maybe listen to something, your phone tells you what, get in, whatever, go to the thing. It's automatic. You're not thinking about it. On radio, and they tell you about a bit of programming a bit more, et cetera, et cetera. So the movement towards that, as he was talking about, the robot can take over.
Right.
So Philip K. Dick said that as well, talking about androids. It's not just all these clunky machines that come on. We have a kind of organic android in us already. And Osho talked about this. He talked about the significance of de-automizing our behavior. We get into a robotic, we do the same thing. I'm sure you see it, or part of your bread and butter is seeing people doing the same thing over and over again. They don't want to do this. They say, Paul, listen, I keep on doing this. I want to stop this doing it, but I keep on doing it. And it's as if there is a robot has taken over. And
Right.
the other part of them says, no, please, I don't want to do that again. Please help me, Paul. I'll give you money, Paul, to stop me doing this. That's the robot comes to the fore. So if you cultivate that robot, make the person more robotic, take away the small, narrow range of opportunity, they won't. But the point is, we won't be able to go back. Once you begin to go across that boundary where some external force can control you in a way that they couldn't do, it's not just an appeal to fear or other things, they can actually control your consciousness. Then that person is a different species. There's something else. And that process of materialization, mechanization will continue. Then they are a node in the network. They will be controlled by artificial intelligence, and they won't have the autonomy. So the only contrary path is an evolved spiritual path, in my view. But there is an attack on spiritual. We talked about dispiriting. This is going to get worse. And people don't understand that really, instead of fighting between different religions, fighting over this and that, I don't care whether people take psychedelic. Good luck to them, whatever, on their spiritual exploration. I'm in favor of that. I support their journey. I get criticized if I say anything against psychedelics. I get emails. And good luck to you. I want people to engage in spiritual exploration as they want to. I'm not criticizing them for that. I'm criticizing the controlled use of these substances in that way to achieve a different purpose. But I'm in favor of us using this contrast to really engage in spiritual exploration. There is a point of no return, that as you become dependent on the technology, there won't be any going back. And that will be the point when network technology, you're forced to be assimilated into it. Mm-hmm. When they say, okay, Paul, mobile phones, bad for you. Now we're joined up. You don't have to go to, get in that or the driving car. It's dull anyway. You can stay at home, do your work. Here's your psychedelics, delivered at the door like the milkman used to do in Ireland, and you get your little chip to communicate, and then it begins to colonize. I think that's the way. I don't think that's a paranoid. That's what the plan is, according to what scientists have said.
Yeah. So it's kind of like I think coming to fruition with from Doctor Who, the Cybermen, because it was always you upgrade to be a part of a Cybermen, which is this collective army, and they don't really think, and if they do, it's for one goal. And so emotional stuff, it's kind of taken out. That's as I'm thinking about the emotional aspect, the controlling of the emotion as into making people more extreme emotional where they're easier to control, or having no emotion where they can be easier to just that. That's what I loved about the character of Mr. Spock on the original Star Trek is
Yeah.
he was a Vulcan and he didn't have emotion, but he had enough human in it because his mother was human that Dr. McCoy would always catch that little bit of humanity coming through. And sometimes that was his shining moments, you know, but lots changed in since the 60s about, you know, because I remember those storylines. It was all about sovereignty and humanity, and now we see that shift now to that technocracy view in popular culture, almost in a positive way. Well, let me ask you. You brought up the spiritual path for people, and I know you'll be the first to say everyone has their own individual path. But if somebody is really kind of struggling with this, seeing everything we've talked about and say, well, I don't want to go that, how do I develop that for myself? Are there some general pointers you'd have that you'd recommend for people who want to kind of disconnect from the collective direction and go their own way?
Yeah, just to finish off on the last point, more dystopia. Remember in Picard as well in Star Trek when they turn him into a Borg with the, I mean, it's talk about program, you know, turn into the Borg, and you cannot resist it. It's futile to resist. I mean, that I think anticipates or is premonitionary of.
Yeah.
Well, the argument is this, or my belief is this. If you start off, you have to go back to the first premise in this. But if you say that consciousness is fundamental in the universe, that and that's a principle that great scientists have come to in the 20th century, that consciousness is fundamental. Right. And if you accept, some scientists don't accept, the human consciousness is of that consciousness, is fundamental, then we are of the most intelligent, fundamental substance of the universe. And that's what all the spiritual traditions say. Whether you want to call it a fractal, a hologram, or a holograph, or a representation, or the image of God, you have it. So I would say first to every individual, that's the first premise. And if you look at Advaita Vedanta and that, a lot of it is just recognize that you are it. I mean, it's that simple. And a lot of people don't, because they're being attacked all the time. They're being deconstructed. You know, you're used to this. Look at this intelligent machine. You know, these machines can beat the best chess masters. They don't tell you about the 100 people that were programming these, that were investing. It's not a fair fight in that sense, you know. And okay, well, that might beat the chess thing, but go down and buy some milk, and they'll be able to do that in the future. But go down and buy a package of milk. I mean, they will do that. The robots are coming on the stream. But if you accept that, if you realize that, if a person could do no more and begin to understand that they are of the greatest consciousness, no matter what limitations they perceive, beyond that false self, the mask, the persona, that the thing behind it is the seer in them is of the greatest consciousness. Everyone has that. Every human person has that, no matter how difficult it might be to see in them, no matter how difficult their circumstances is, they have that. So that's a very, very important thing. It's been so attacked that fundamental principle is being forgotten. So that's the first principle, and all the perennial philosophy says that whatever is in you behind that circumstance is the great truth. And you have to accept that. It's a basis of Christianity in relation to the kingdom, and where is it? And in the non-canonical Gospel of Thomas, well, it's in a number of them, you know, where is the kingdom? And it's in yourself is the answer to it. The kingdom of heaven, meaning in my view, that it's coterminous with consciousness. It's what Blake talked about, the imagination. He equated Jesus with the imagination being the poetic genius of us. Right. It's that fun that you have it. You don't have to work to that. It's a gift. It's given to you. Whether you want to say it evolves over aeons, whatever, we still have it. That's the starting point. Realize that. That's the first. I mean, it is game changing. The second thing is, if you have it, then you have to activate it. You have to believe in it. If you begin to take control because you're of that thing, of that substance. You're made of this, of those stuff that dreams are made of. You're made of that thing. Well, then you have to activate it. All the people that achieved anything in history did it through the activation of their full consciousness. They did it through that process of taking control of their sovereignty. And in psychological terms, in Maslow's work, as you know well, the process then comes in of actualization. What are your actualization? Your actualization, your bedrock consciousness, you're activating it. So inherent in that is autonomy that comes from the basic, from what you have already. You have to recognize that, your own borders, etc. Before you can go, you have to establish yourself before you can flower. You need that self-contained growth to a certain point before the efflorescence. The agency comes into that, which is a function of autonomy, that you have control over your life. Of course, there's great difficulties, and Frankl talked about that, but still, Viktor Frankl says, as we know, in the concentration camp, you still have a choice about how you react to the circumstance. So that activation agency gives you an opportunity to actualize. And that's where contentedness, happiness is in the spiritual tradition, or the peace of mind. And it's the feature that Maslow noted about self-actualization was often associated with people who had come to the top of that pyramid, where they had often a mystical experience, but they had those experiences because they were open to it. They were taking control over their life. So if one starts off with the right premise and appreciates again who we are and doesn't fall for that deconstructive control thing from outside, and appreciates that and can recognize that, well, then we won't be dragged off the path. And following from that is, where do we give attention to? Worship and attention are a similar thing. So if we find out that we're spending 90% of our time watching how some American football team is doing, for example, instead of something else, well, there's a cost for that. You know, there's a benefit, but there's a cost. I mean, in the overall scheme of things, it's not that important, I'm sorry to say, for people that do spend 90%. But I mean, there are other things in life. In relation to these things, we have to ask, what are the things that can be taken away from us, and what is us? There's no pockets and shrouds. We won't be taking any of these material things with us. It's about relationships, as all the people that studied actualization said, that it's the recognition of first your own self-worth, and then the recognition of the other person. And from there, beginning to expand. And we know from the near-death experiences that people come back with a sense of understanding or comprehension of their interaction with other people. And that's the critical thing. They get less materialistic and they get more focused on those relationships and spiritual things. So I really think that you make a few important points for me listening to you when you're talking about what works. And you make a point again and again, as far as I can see, that a whole range of different strategies can work to achieve results. It's quite pragmatic, that this may work, but this may work as well. So don't get too, it's a similar thing. You have to have a sense of where you're starting from and where do you want to go from. Now, that doesn't mean that it's easy, but those key elements of acceptance of what you are in a deep sense, and then activation of your consciousness, actualization in the context of autonomy, is what all the traditions say. And that's what most of the human potential, or a lot of the various of your business says about psychotherapy. They're all the same concept, but they have to come from the first principle, the first cause, the first basic principle, acceptance of the value of who you are. And the last point on this, Paul, included in that is, what advantage do we have over computers? When they get all these computers, oh, we can do this. The advantage that we have, curiously, is what we think is our greatest weakness, is the ability to make mistakes. And this is the thing that people don't understand. So maybe when Christ was saying about, he's come for the sinners, that what he was explaining was that, and the forgiveness of it is, in one interpretation, is that if you make mistakes, you learn from the mistakes, but you can also grow in the process. Because the machine certainly will learn through a process, and machine learning is a dangerous idea because we've given the reins to something else, to an automaton. But when we make mistakes, we learn and we grow. And that's part of acceptance process as well. That if we think that when we go off in a blind alley, we learn something and we incorporate. So machines don't do that process. We can our human capacity to evolve is also based on our willingness to accept our flaws.
Right.
And that machines are not going to do that. We can actually think in alternative paths. If we can't beat them in Go, it's not the end of the world. You know, we can invent a game, but they can't beat. Kind of poetic game, which involves, I don't know, whatever. So a metaphorical game, a game involving the higher order skills in art that we've learned, that with analogy that they can't, whatever. We can evolve too. So what I would say to people is that path is there. I would also say as well that the last point, that we have to get back in touch with what we're adapted to, which is nature.
Yes.
That we're getting more and more. When is the last time you walked barefoot on the ground? When is the last time you went swimming in a lake? When is the last time you went up in the hills? When is the last time you were out animals? When was the last time you were in darkness? When is the last time you were out camping? When is it, whatever? Mm-hmm. This is what we're adapted to. Right. More and more, we're getting dragged into the technosphere instead of the biosphere, at the expense of the biosphere. And we are programmed by nature to work in that environment. In an alien environment, we will experience anomie and alienation because we will become the aliens. The human person is going to become the alien in this world in a generation if they don't take an alternative path. We will be the ones that are the strange ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think recognizing that is the first step to, hopefully rectifying it. Well, James, you have given, as usual, a treasure trove of things for reflection, because I like I said, I think this is so fundamental to what's going on. I mean, with everything. I mean, our human experience. So. I want to thank you for talking to me today, and let's do another chat in the future. Are you up for it?
Yes, certainly. And I just as a final point, yeah. I don't put any of those messages forward as a depression-inducing, pessimistic. That's not my message. My message is that we're all of the light. That we're all of that, and we all have great qualities. We have dark sides as well, but that whatever is happening, we can overcome it by activating our things. So it's my argument is in favor of people. So I don't want to appear too miserable. It's the opposite. My argument is an affirmation, and it's against misanthropy, and it's against humans. So I think if people begin to look at the literature, look at what the great spiritual leaders have said for whatever tradition, you can learn from whatever tradition, that's where our great strength is. And so I'll end on an optimistic note, but I'll be looking forward to the conversation again and to develop some of the themes. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.